Hello, 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 everybody. This is Attorney Augustus Corbett, aka the Minister of Justice. I am one half of the Defiant Lawyers. The other half is on vacay this weekend, celebrating after a big trial that we had this past week. But anyway, we have an exciting show lined up for you. And as always, I'm bringing you what we bring you each and every Saturday, a legal analysis of trending politics, policies, personalities, and pop culture to empower you with the information you need to defy an unjust legal system. And when I say unjust, I mean it is unjust. And you're going to see today why we say that every Saturday. You're going to see why. So if you're not a subscriber, please go ahead and subscribe. Also like, share, comment, and engage with us as we talk about things that are extremely important to the African American experience. So as you see, we're going to talk about something you probably never heard of, but it's going to blow your mind. I'm going to briefly talk about the sad story of George Anderson. You're going to hear more from his family on Monday, this coming Juneteenth. I'm going to remind you of this awful event that occurred in Charleston, South Carolina, 8 years ago today, actually. And the Minneapolis Police Department. Going to make a few comments about that. So stay tuned. We have an exciting show for you. Thank you for staying with us today. It is always so good to be with you all. I love you people. I appreciate you folks for tuning in each and every week so that we can, again, just empower you. That's our goal. We want to empower you with the information that you need to, again, to defy this unjust legal system. This thing is really, really, really tilted against us, you all. I'm not joking. I'm giving you my inside view. I work in this thing and have worked in it now for over 15 years. And I'm telling you, the legal system is not our friend. It was not designed to favor us, and it oftentimes does not. As is really depicted in this very sad story about a man named George Anderson. George Anderson. Now, I'm going to just briefly introduce you to Mr. Anderson's plight and his family. And I don't want to go very far in detail about it because I'm going to have one of his family members on this coming Monday on Juneteenth, the actual holiday, June 19th. And then the week following that, we're going to have more family members on to talk to you about Mr. Anderson's situation. And then the week after that, we're going to have more family members. So we're going to, over a 3-part series, we're going to share with you the sad, sad, sad story of George Anderson. Okay? Now, I'm going to give you just some brief introductory remarks now, but also I'm going to talk to you about this very, very heinous, vicious shooting that occurred in Mother Emanuel AME Zion Church in Charleston, South Carolina. I don't know if you've ever been to Charleston. I've visited a couple of times. There's a lot of history there, and so it doesn't surprise me that this type of a vicious act occurred in Charleston, South Carolina, right, of all places. And then the Minneapolis Police Department. Doesn't surprise me at all that they're in the crosshairs of the United States Justice Department, right, after what we saw occurred with George Floyd at the hands of Derek Chauvin and 3 of his colleagues. All right, so before I say anything else, Happy Father's Day. Happy Father's Day to you, fella fathers. Wow. Our sort of celebration day is nowhere near as big as Mother's Day, right? Everybody, love to celebrate Mother's Day, but it's still big. And that's because, what we do for our families on a daily basis is extremely important. And so I salute every one of you fathers, and especially you African American fathers who oftentimes we're not considered to be good fathers, right? There's so much talk about absentee black fathers. But there's research out there that says that African American fathers are actually more involved with their children than other fathers. Although many times we're not in the home with our children, we're still very involved fathers. Okay. And I have been doing a lot of historical research in my family and other families. And I can tell you that, man, fatherhood, motherhood, the black family, throughout slavery, throughout Jim Crow, with all of the challenges we had, it is amazing that our families stayed intact. They stayed intact. And a lot of that has to do with fathers. Now, I'm doing some heavy duty research to substantiate that fact because we have heard over the years that slavery destroyed the black family. And okay, I mean, anecdotally, I don't see that. By that, I mean, when I look at my family, when I look as far back as my great great grandfather, he and my great great grandmother were married, Emily Thomas and Emily Williams. And then my great grandfather, Jim, his name was James, they called him Jim. And my great grandmother, Jane, were married. My grandmother, Ella, and Luther James were married. Ella Williams James was married to Luther James. And then my parents, Oscar and Ella Mae Corbett, as well as most of my aunts and uncles. I mean, every one of them. And I had maybe 10 or 11 or so, I can't remember, maybe 12 or so uncles and aunts growing up, and they were all married. So when I look anecdotally at my family, I see strong marriages and strong fathers, despite slavery, despite Jim Crow, despite all of that. Now, we begin to see in the 50s something called the Great Migration. And that was when African American people were trying to escape all of the indignities of Jim Crow. And many of them left the South and went north, they went Midwest, they went west, they went northwest, trying to escape, again, the horrors of Jim Crow South, the lynchings and all the stuff the KKK was doing to try to make black Americans feel like second-class citizens. And during that period, a lot of black men began to separate from their families, trying to again escape Jim Crow. And I believe that may have set off what we currently see, which is about 3 out of every 4 black children being born to a single mother. I think that may have been the impetus to get that started. I'm not sure. I'm researching it. I will let you know once I am comfortable saying, here are the facts. Nonetheless, happy Father's Day. That's what I wanted to simply say. Happy Father's Day. But this is also not just Father's Day weekend. This is also another very important and very special day or weekend. This is Juneteenth weekend, the day that enslaved Africans here learned almost 3 years after slavery ended that slavery had been abolished. There in Galveston Beach, Texas, a place that I've been many times. In fact, I was there this time last year. But now this holiday has become pretty much the holiday that many African Americans celebrate the end of slavery, although it really had very little to do with enslaved folks outside of Texas, but still it has just become the celebratory day for African Americans to celebrate the end of slavery. And I've been celebrating it ever since I've been here to Texas. Now, my wife and I, we joke all the time. We'd never heard of Juneteenth until we got to Texas. And then we got here and there's all this Juneteenth stuff. And we were like, what in the world is Juneteenth? And once we learned what it was, we, of course, celebrated it big time and have been doing so for about 17 years now. That's really, Juneteenth is really my 4th of July. I have nothing for the 4th of July. I mean, it means nothing to me. I mean, nothing. As Frederick Douglass said, what doth the 4th of July have to do to the Negro or for the Negro? Nothing. Nothing. So Juneteenth is my day. And to all of you out there, enjoy Juneteenth celebration weekend. It's actually on Monday. Where we live here in the Dallas area, Dallas County is shut down for Juneteenth. So not only celebrate, though, also do some things, some empowering things, right? Do some, educate yourself, read a book, watch a good movie about the struggle. Do something to empower yourself, not just celebrate. Create some wealth, right? Something to really, really memorialize the importance of Juneteenth. Okay. Now, with that said, let's now talk about this really sad story of a man named George Anderson. George Anderson. Now, I'm not going to get far into this story because I don't want to spoil it for the family member who will be on my show Monday, okay, on Juneteenth Day. It's a very appropriate day for her to be up here with me to talk about George Anderson. Suffice it to say that the story of George Anderson may be the largest, most significant case of property theft in American history. That is not hyperbole. That is not me just trying to say something to get you riled up. Although this ought to rile you up because this story is completely, totally outrageous. On an economic level, what happened to George Anderson and his family is bigger than Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I kid you not. I kid you not. So I'm excited to share this story with you because it's a part of the narrative of the fact that America has this just deeply, profoundly racist legacy of doing everything in its power to try and disenfranchise, to, relegate African-American people to second-class citizenship over the years. I mean, for 400 years, it's been a constant fight. And this may be the biggest story. Help me get the word out on this story. I pray this story ends up on Oprah Winfrey. I pray it ends up on every major Netflix, every major outlet there is. This needs to be told. This needs to be told. The wealth that this family allegedly was defrauded out of by many, many, many people and entities and banks and companies and so forth, all having to do with oil and gas here in Texas. That's all I'm going to share with you right now, because the great granddaughter of Mr. George Anderson is going to share with us on Monday what has happened to her family. Okay? So that's all I want to say about Mr. Anderson's situation for now. All right. Let's now remember what happened to those 9 precious, innocent people in Charleston, South Carolina. That happened in 2015. Let me pull it up. 2015, today, June the 17th, 2015. These 9 precious people were murdered in church after Bible study and prayer by a white supremacist who literally sat in the church with these people for the Bible study, heard the word of God, these people loving on him, and afterwards he pulls out a 9mm and shoots them all dead. Shoots them all dead in church after hearing the word of God. That is how evil white supremacy, the ideology of white supremacy, that is how evil it is. White supremacy is responsible for the death of hundreds of millions of people, primarily Black people. That is how dangerous it is, and it's why I fight it. I call it out, and I fight it. These 9 people should be here today. And if they're not here today because of death, it should be because of natural causes, not because some vicious, demon-possessed white supremacist who wrapped himself in a Confederate flag, who had hate for people merely because of their pigmentation, their ethnicity, would sit in a church service where they're literally calling on Jesus. And I'm a committed Christian, where people literally calling on Jesus and studying the Bible and loving him. And his heart was so hard, so full of hatred, such a white supremacist, that he pulls out a gun after all of that and murdered these people. So let's remember them and their families. In fact, let's take some time right now and just a moment of silence for them and their family. Thank you very much. Keep this family in your prayers, because I'm sure 8 years later, it is still heartbreaking. Any of us who have had loved ones to die, we know, you never really get over it. You learn how to cope, you learn how to move on, but you never get over it. And then, days like this, where it's, such a national thing and, associated with Juneteenth, because it happened. In fact, this guy planned it for that. He went to the sort of the place where the African American community is strongest, the church. And he did it on the day or the weekend where we, again, are celebrating the abolition of slavery. So he planned it. He knew exactly what he was doing. And so every Juneteenth, every time it comes around, this family or these families are reminded of the vicious loss of their loved ones. And I can tell you, and all of us know, anyone who has been killed in a tragedy like this, when someone does this to you, it's like a double injury. It's a double It's a double injustice. It's not only what they did, but, especially when the justice system doesn't give family members justice, it's like a double injustice. Well, this guy did receive the death penalty, but I mean, that doesn't bring anybody back. So keep them in your prayers, every single one of them. The gentleman at the top of the photo there in the middle, I think his name was Pinckney. I think he was the pastor of the church, and he was also a South Carolina state representative. His life no more precious than all the rest, but I'm just pointing out that what a heinous crime this was. And before I leave this, let me just remind you that one of the South Carolina senators, an African-American man named Tim Scott, has the unmitigated gall to look us in our faces on television and say that America is not a racist country. A black man has the unmitigated gall, the hubris, to look us in our faces, African Americans in our faces, and say to us, despite this happening in his state, despite other instances of this happening, for example, in Buffalo, New York, the Tree of Life shooting of the Jewish people, the guy was just convicted yesterday. That was a hate crime. Despite all of this, the story of George Anderson, and we're going to look at the Minneapolis Police Department here in just a minute. Despite all of this, the fact that black women die disproportionately during birth more than any other person, the fact that African-American men are disproportionately killed by homicide, the fact that there's this huge wealth gap in this country, the fact that there's this huge education gap in this country. I could go on and on and on and on and on and on, showing you that systemic racism is very much alive in this country, yet this black man has the gall to look us in the face and tell us that the sky is not blue. And then, in the same breath, ask us to elect him to the presidency office so that he can continue his white supremacist campaign, because that's what it is. That's what it is. And by the way, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris also said that America is not a racist country. By the way, just to throw that in, 2 Democrats, 1 black female, and she knows better, and Joe knows better. I presume they said it for votes. Tim Scott, however, I think he means it. I think he believes it. So keep these folks in your remembrance, their families especially. Okay. Let me just mention this real quickly. I got joy looking at this story, the fact that African leaders visited Ukraine and Russia. Let me tell you why this excited me before we talk about the Minneapolis Police Department. This excites me because it's about time, right, that the African nations, the African leaders, the black sub-Saharan African leaders make their presence felt, make their voices heard, because they are critical to this war. They are very, very important to this war, so their voices should be heard. Why are they so critical? Because we know that Russia gets financial support from a lot of the African countries. His country and some group called the Wagner Group is over there taking resources out of Africa and using those resources to wage war in Ukraine. So these African leaders have a lot of influence. And I'm so happy to see them saying, and I don't know if these leaders are the one, I think so, are the ones where a lot of the wealth is coming from that's being used to wage the Russian-Ukrainian war, or massacre, if you will, sometimes, although the Ukrainian people have fought very bravely, very gallantly. Big shout out to those folks. They have resisted with everything they got, right? But the fact that the African leaders, some of them are over there trying to broker peace, essentially saying, you know, if you want our money, we need to end this. Hopefully what they're saying is our money is needed for our people, not to be waging war. I hope that's what they're saying. So we need you to get this over so that we can begin to fund the empowerment, the prosperity, the education, the uplift of our own people, not sending it to Russia to wage an unjust war. So I was very happy to see that African leaders were, in fact, over in Russia and Ukraine and putting some pressure and trying to broker a peace deal. Way to go. Yes, the black man sits on top of some of the greatest wealth in the world. The continent of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is wealthy, filled with wealth. And it's about time that you know, these African men stand up and say, and there is one, I think she's still president of Liberia, President Johnson. I believe she's still president there. So one African female president, but I don't know that she's with them on this trip. I'm just glad to see those guys over there. All right. So the Minneapolis Police Department. I want to cover this because, of course, this has to do with the murder of George Floyd. And hold on, there's a video that I want to play here. Has to do with George Floyd, but not just George Floyd. It has to do with policing across the country. We are happy that the Department of Justice is once again monitoring police departments across the country, right? And are finding some of them wanting. We're very happy about that. That ended under the Trump administration. As a matter of fact, the Obama administration had found many police departments in violation of federal law and issued these dissent decrees, and the police departments that Obama Department of Justice under Eric Holder and then Loretta Lynch. Okay, I digress. Entered into were summarily terminated when Trump came into office and Jeff Sessions took over the Department of Justice. But now these police departments are once again being monitored and looked at by the Department of Justice. And so that's why I want to talk about the Minneapolis Police Department here for a little bit here. Let's start with a video. We're not going to look at the whole video, but it's a video that Merrick Garland did, the Attorney General did, to announce that this report was issued. Let's watch a little bit of that.
Good morning, everyone. Here with me today are Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta, Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Kristen Clark, and First Assistant United States Attorney Ann Billson. I also want to acknowledge Mayor Jacob Fry, Council President Andrea Jenkins, Community Safety Commissioner Cedric Alexander, and Police Chief Brian O'Hara. Thank you all for joining us today. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was killed at the hands of a law enforcement officer who was sworn to protect him. As Mr. Floyd died, other officers failed to intervene. The Justice Department has since convicted 4 former Minneapolis police officers for their roles in the death of George Floyd. As I told George Floyd's family this morning, his death has had an irrevocable impact on the Minneapolis community, on our country, and on the world. His loss is still felt deeply by those who loved and knew him and by many who did not. George Floyd should be alive today. Shortly after I was sworn in as Attorney General, I announced that the Justice Department had opened a separate civil investigation into whether the Minneapolis Police Department, the MPD, and the City of Minneapolis engage in a pattern or practice of unconstitutional or unlawful policing. I am here today to announce the findings of that investigation. I am also announcing that the Justice Department, the City of Minneapolis, and the MPD have agreed in principle to negotiate towards a consent decree. Since opening the investigation, the Justice Department has engaged in a comprehensive review of MPD's policies, training, supervision, and use of force investigations. Our review focused on MPD as a whole, not on the actions of any individual officer. We observed many MPD officers who did their difficult work with professionalism, courage, and respect. But the patterns and practices we observed made what happened to George Floyd possible. As one city leader told us, quote, "These systemic issues didn't just occur on May 25th, 2020. There were instances like that were being..."
All right. You heard the general talk about patterns and practices. All right. So what that means is the Minneapolis Police Department was not just characterized by Derek Chauvin. In other words, he was not just one bad apple. You know, he was not just one bad cop. You know, because we often hear, you know, he was a bad cop, the rest of them are good cops. That's not what the Department of Justice found about the Minneapolis Police Department. What the Justice Department found about the Minneapolis Police Department is that there is a pattern and there are practices of certain unconstitutional activities, behavior, conduct. So essentially they're saying the Minneapolis Police Department itself, not just Derek Chauvin and his 3 former cop colleagues who lynched George Floyd. But the patterns and practices of the Minneapolis Police Department are racist, discriminatory. I want you to understand that. Those words are key in these types of cases. Patterns and practices. That's why when Tim Scott look us in the face and say America is not a racist country, he's a liar. Because we're not talking about mere individual racism. We're talking about patterns and practices. In other words, systemic racism. The general is essentially saying Minneapolis exhibited systemic racism within its police force. That's critical. All right, let's go back. But I wanted to highlight that. Very, very important.
Supported by the community long before that. The Department of Justice has concluded that there is reasonable cause to believe that the Minneapolis Police Department and the City of Minneapolis engaged in a pattern or practice of conduct that violates the First and Fourth Amendments of the United States Constitution. There is also reasonable cause to believe that they engage in conduct that violates Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Safe Streets Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Specifically, we found that MPD and the City of Minneapolis engages in a pattern or practice of using excessive force, unlawfully discriminating against Black and Native American people in enforcement activities, violating the rights of people engaged in protected speech, and discriminating against people with behavioral disabilities and responding to them in crisis. I will discuss each finding in somewhat greater detail.
All right, now this video is about an hour long, so we don't have time to watch all that video, but we got the gist of it. And let me take you to the actual report itself. And here's exactly what Attorney General Garland was saying. He was saying, we can read it right here. Let me pull this down a little bit. Says, our federal investigation, well, let's go back. This is the executive summary. On April 21st, 2021, the Department of Justice opened a pattern or practice investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department and the city of Minneapolis. By then, Derek Chauvin had been convicted in state court for the tragic murder of George Floyd in 2020. In the years before, shootings by other MPD officers had generated public outcry, culminating in weeks of civil unrest after George Floyd was killed. Our federal investigation focused on the police department as a whole, as I was just explaining, not the acts of any one officer. To be sure, many MPD officers do their difficult work with professionalism, courage, and respect. Nevertheless, our investigation found that the systemic problems, there's the word, in MPD, the Minneapolis Police Department, made what happened to George Floyd possible. All right? So here are their findings. The Department of Justice has reasonable cause to believe that the city of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department engage in a pattern or practice of conduct that deprives people of their rights under the Constitution and federal law. MPD uses excessive force. This is what the Justice Department found. This is the pattern and the practice of the MPD. They have a pattern and practice of using excessive force, including unjustified deadly force and other types of force. So what we saw with George Floyd was really one instance of a pattern or practices of excessive force. And then it goes on to say the MPD unlawfully discriminates against Black and Native American people in its enforcement activities. So that means, for example, there's a lot of racial profiling, and the general is going to go on to explain all this. We just don't have time to watch all that. But there is a pattern of racial profiling, and you may not know how insidious that is. You may, if you're African American, you may, because you have most likely been the victim of it. But as an attorney, we see it all the time. Sometimes, folks like to say that the African American male particularly is, just sort of disproportionately criminal, that we commit a lot of the crime. We are convicted more often than other people, and they try to make the argument, therefore, Black men are, very crime-prone people. Not true. Not true. What is happening is the police departments are targeting Black men. They are racially profiling Black men. I cannot tell you how many cases I have represented folks over the last 16 years where my client, the person who was arrested, was in a car that was in, say, a neighborhood, a Black neighborhood, or was in a car that typically Black guys drive, or playing music typically Black guys play. Some racial reason why the person was stopped. And the point is, if a group of folks is being targeted like that, then quite naturally, you're going to find more of them committing crime than ordinarily. It's the same as if you targeted white guys. That's going to increase the number of white guys who end up in the criminal justice system just because you're targeting them. So it's that type of pattern or practice that results in so many Black folks ending up in the criminal justice system, from traffic tickets on up to the bigger things. We remember with what city was that? The city where Mike Brown, Ferguson, Missouri, I think. It came out that the city is like almost 60% African American, and those and a lot of them were close to poverty. Yet it was those same people who the city used to generate a lot of their income from traffic tickets. And you may say, well, what's the big deal about traffic tickets? A lot, because someone gets stopped with a suspended license, they're targeted, they got a suspended license, they go to jail, they're put under $1,000 bond, they don't have it. As a result, they lose a job, they lose an apartment. I mean, it can turn their lives upside down. And then when they get out of jail, they got to come back to court and pay a $300 fine, pay $200 in court costs for a person who may be unemployed or underemployed. And that's most of the money that the city uses to operate its court system, its offices. I mean, it is ridiculous. It's exactly what the Minneapolis Police Department was in fact doing. All right, let's go back. Just giving you a perspective. As an attorney, I do this every day. I see it every day, so I know what I'm talking about. All right. The report found that the MPD unlawfully discriminates against Black and Native American people in its enforcement activities. That also means that whereas someone, the police, if they were stopping and arresting a white kid, they would charge them with a lesser offense than they would the Black or the Native American. There are many ways that this discrimination can manifest in enforcement activities. Many ways. And they found that there were a pattern and practice of there being this discrimination with the MPD enforcement activities. Goes on to say MPD violates the rights of people engaged in protected speech. Protesters. Okay, protesters. We saw that here in the city of Dallas back when the George Floyd protests were going on. And let me just shout out those young people who hit the streets when George Floyd was lynched. Black, white, all kind of folks all over the world actually protesting the lynching of George Floyd. But the police department here, the police chief, who's an African-American female, by the way, she was very, very heavy-handed with the protesters. Very heavy-handed. Many of them got hurt. Many of them were shot with rubber bullets. And I mean, you may think what's the big deal? Well, people's eyes were put out. I mean, it was serious. And all they were out there doing was simply saying what we saw a police officer doing to George Floyd was heinous. So that's what they're getting at here, targeting people engaged in protected speech, protesters. Our firm represented a number of those folks, pro bono, who had been out, a lot of them young people who went out protesting and were charged with rioting, with rioting. All right. We got those cases dismissed. We're in the process of getting them expunged. Okay. So police departments across the country did this. There are some states like Florida, for example, and others, I think maybe even Texas and Oklahoma, who passed anti-protest laws that makes it a felony in some cases to protest. So the MPD did this, engaged in patterns and practices of targeting protesters, basically. And fourth of all, MPD and the city discriminate against people with behavioral health disabilities when responding to calls for assistance. That, too, is a very bad pattern. Oftentimes, it can result in the death of people with mental illness, right? I mean, mentally ill people need to be dealt with very, very gingerly. All right, because if they're having an episode, they can be needlessly killed by a trigger happy cop. Okay, and according to the DOJ, the Minneapolis Police Department treated such people in a discriminatory way. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about the Minneapolis Police Department's, the U.S. Department of Justice finding about the Minneapolis Police Department, because there are probably, man, what, 25, 30, 40, 50 more police departments that also need to be monitored just like this, that are notorious for the way they discriminate against blacks and other minorities, for the way that they discriminate in their enforcement activities, all the things that we see here. And many of them, again, were under consent decrees with the Department of Justice, but the Trump administration got rid of all of them, every last one of them. So, and my wife texted me just a moment ago and said, remind everybody that this is another reason why voting matters. That is exactly right. Absolutely right. Because just like that, another administration came in and immediately the Department of Justice is active again, doing what it should be doing, and that is civil rights enforcement, civil rights investigation. That's a part of the reason why it exists, right? And one of the other things that Joe Biden did, and by the way, I'm not a Democrat, but I appreciate the focus that he has put on issues of justice that were ignored and overlooked under the Trump administration. But another thing that that Merrick Garland did was it appointed Kristen Clark over the Civil Rights Division. Kristen Clark was an attorney for the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, I think was the name of the organization that she chaired. She is a brilliant and very good civil rights attorney, and very social justice minded. And having her in that position is the reason why we are seeing some of the restored activities having to do with civil rights in the Department of Justice. Again, as my wife said, all because of an election. So elections absolutely, totally do matter. So we need to be involved in all of them. Last week we talked about how the GOP is trying to undermine our right to vote, despite last week's shock and surprise of them allowing Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to stand. Still, they are doing everything they can to undermine our right to vote for one simple reason. If people go out in record numbers or even in normal numbers and vote, you know what? The GOP doesn't win. It doesn't win. They know their chances of winning are best when folks don't show up or when they are able to cheat, keep certain people from voting with voter ID laws and other tricks, cutting short the number of hours to vote or number of days to vote, no mail-in ballots, anything they can do to keep the numbers down. That tends to favor them. All right, before I get out of here, let me thank some of our commenters. Our longtime friend, Sean Breezy, thank you for tuning in, sir. Thank you very much. Y. Ray, happy Father's Day. Thank you very much. And I presume this is a woman. I could be wrong. Y. Ray, could be a man or woman. Thank you for tuning in. And he or she says, teach them. Thank you. I certainly will. All right. So that is going to be the end of our show today. I went over everything that I wanted to go over. My daughter's not here with me today. It's always, just a little something missing when she's not here, bringing that young perspective, that young mind, right? I mean, I miss not having her here, but she need this vacation, this 3-day vacation, where she is cruising. Reminds me of an old Eddie Kendrick song, Cruising. I think it's Eddie Kendrick. Somebody. Okay, I just dated myself. You all probably never heard of Eddie Kendricks. Who is Eddie Kendricks? He was one of the Temptations. All right, y'all. Listen, that's going to do it for today. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back next week, Chloe and I, with another video that, again, is all about empowering you every time. That's what it's about. It's about empowering you. It's not about foolishness. We're not talking about what's going on in the hip-hop community unless it's a legal issue. We're not talking about what's happening with Shannon Sharp, although I like Shannon Sharp. We're not talking about, that's not our space. Our space is empowering you with the legal information you need to defy this unjust legal system. That's our space. All right? So, peace, love, soul.